I'm starting this story off with Lil Durk's lawyer is earning his paycheck. Lil Durk and his lawyer are requesting for his immediate release once again. And the reasoning behind this request will once again be the accusation of collusion between the judge and the prosecution. Lil Durk will begin to question his treatment behind bars, even while being in custody for murder and murder for hire. Lil Durk would equate his treatment in jail as if he were a cartel leader or an international war criminal. Things such as having an anonymous jury and things like that only happen in those cases I said previously. Lil Durk would submit multiple immediate release motions and bail packages with millions of dollars willing to be forfeited, but Lil Durk would always be denied at every turn. And after being locked up a year and a half, we find out why. The judge and the prosecutor in the Lil Durk case would receive death threats by fans, or people claiming to be fans. February 22nd, 2025, 4 threatening voicemails to Judge Donahue referencing Mr. Banks and threatening Judge Donahue and courthouse personnel. February 25th, 2025, USMS contacts Chambers and USAO. FBI opens investigation. S.A. Corcoran becomes FBI point of contact and actively investigates threats. April 28th, 2025, threatening call to AUSA UNEO with death threats to AUSA UNEO and courthouse/USAO personnel. May 1st, 3 days later, the United States Attorney's Office obtained a second superseding indictment in this case docket, 147. May 8th, a week later, a detention hearing before Judge Donahue, and the threats still. And now we know why Durk bail packages have all been denied. Since February, the judges and the prosecution in this case have been getting threats, and the FBI is taking these threats very serious. So Lil Durk and his attorneys are saying that the judges and the prosecution were biased against Lil Durk because they've been receiving these threats. So Durk's lawyers are saying that the fact that the judge and the prosecution were hiding these threats means they were hiding a bias towards Lil Durk and his release, which is why I said Lil Durk's lawyer is earning his paycheck, because it makes a little sense. But I thought it made more sense to why they had to hold Lil Durk instead of release him. But the issue is that Lil Durk's lawyer wasn't presented with all the information to mount a proper defense. And that's what Lil Durk's lawyers are alleging. Now, if the judge is claiming to receive threats from somebody on my behalf, and I go in front of that same judge for a bond hearing, and she rejects it just because of the threat she was receiving, but never told my lawyer, that is prejudicial. June 2nd, 2025, detention hearing and pretrial motion hearing on defendant's motion to disclose grand jury transcripts before Judge Fitzgerald. Threats still undisclosed to defense, continued detention. Ordered ruling pending on motion to disclose. August 6th and 13th, 2025. Conferences between prosecution team and undersigned defense counsel anonymous jury threat still undisclosed. Continued detention order pending or motion to disclose. And this right here is the part where the judge never disclosed the threats and didn't give Durk the opportunity to defend himself. And also the judge requesting an anonymous jury for those same reasons, and also not telling Lil Durk or the defense team why. And October 1st, 2025, is when the defense heard murmurs of the threats and acted immediately. First partial disclosure of threats by the government, defense makes oral demands for immediate disclosure of all relevant undisclosed to defense. October 1st, 2025, first partial disclosure of threats by the government, defense makes oral demands for immediate disclosure of all relevant materials and communications about threats. Not gonna lie, that should be grounds for a mistrial already. The judge and the prosecution are receiving threats for people that say they're moving for Lil Durk. The judge and the prosecution not telling the defense about those threats. In fact, they're denying his motions for release based on those same threats and never disclosed that with the defense. Once again, I'm sorry, but there's never been more grounds for a mistrial than ever, because now the judge and the prosecution can be considered victims in this case. And if the threats are ever brought up in trial, that would make the prosecution and the judge witnesses in the Lil Durk case. And Lil Durk's lawyer would bring up those exact points and why the case needs to be dismissed. So not only was the prosecution and the judge receiving threats behind the scenes, the judge and the prosecution would have ex parte communication and meetings about said threats. And the defense not being present at those ex parte meetings is a violation of Lil Durk's rights as well. And the defense would further argue, compounded by the undisclosed ex parte communications between the prosecution team and the bench about these threats has irrefutably compromised the structural integrity of the proceedings. Drew Findling would further argue the prosecution's 7-month silence deprived defendant of their 5th and 6th Amendment rights to due process and an impartial tribunal. During this period, defendants unknowingly litigated critical matters, including detention proceedings, with pretrial motions before judicial officers operating under the cloud of undisclosed threats. The defense further goes on to say, If we were told of these threats, we would have asked for a recusal of all parties involved immediately. Before the bail packages and the hearings, the concealment prevented defendants from seeking recusal, challenging the fairness of proceeding, or making informed strategic decisions. The resulting appearance of partially amplified by ex parte discussions between the bench and the prosecution about threats directly implicating defendants has created an incurable breach of judicial neutrality that no lesser remedy than full recusal of the central district bench can cure. Now, if you didn't understand any of that, instead of going for a mistrial, Drew Finland's actually trying to say that not one prosecutor over there is uncompromised and the case needs to be thrown out altogether. Now, it's completely impossible for this to work, and I think it's because the defense overplayed their hand. Unfortunately, you can't disqualify every prosecutor who was going to prosecute against you. I think if they would have kept it to just the prosecutor on the case and the judge in this case, they could have argued for their mistrial, maybe got the mistrial. Lil Durk possibly could have got released, and then they could have fought another day. But that was the best case scenario if that motion were to pass. Now, like I said, the biggest win for Lil Durk in this situation is the recusal of the judge. So this document shows that Lil Durk's defense isn't necessarily trying to get every judge and prosecutor disqualified. They just want the case in a different district to where the judge won't be biased and Lil Durk can have a fair trial. It says the judiciary's legitimacy depends on public confidence that justice is not only done, but seen to be done. That confidence is shaken here. Defendants, therefore, respectfully urge the court to dismiss the indictment or at the very least to disqualify the USAO CDCA and reassign this matter to a district untainted by the government's non-disclosure. So like I said, you can't disqualify every judge or every prosecutor from this case, but you can ask that the case get reassigned or the judge get reassigned. Did I think this motion was going to free Lil Durk? Absolutely not. I think Lil Durk has a long and hard fight ahead of him for his freedom. Lil Durk has been gone for a little over a year, and the lawyers are still just going through the motions right now, literally. But let me know in the comments, do you think Lil Durk and his attorneys can get the judge and the prosecution thrown off this case? Or do you think all the smoke and mirrors won't change the fact that Lil Durk will never come home again? And if you made it this far, click the left side of your screen to see why Olivia the DoorDasher was arrested for exactly what she deserves. And also, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, share to be aware, put me in that outcome Sunday to be there, man. Because I know there's 10 other streamers out there doing it like me, but
fuck that little 10. I'm maxed out.